everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Rapping with the Rep. I'm State Representative Ken Gordon, and today we're going to have a special show. I started Rapping with the Rep a few years ago because I wanted to give our residents the opportunity to hear directly from some of the Beacon Hill newsmakers without the filter of some of the local information sources. That was because we had reached a point where the number of media outlets covering our area had diminished, and I wanted to give the opportunity for our residents to get really the direct scoop on information. Today what we're going to do is we're going to talk to Professor Dan Kennedy from Northeastern University, who is a media critic and also authored a book called The Wired City about local media outlets, the emergence of local media outlets. And we're going to talk to Rich Hosford from right here from BCAT and B News. Welcome to our show.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to see you as well.
Good to see you, Rich.
Student at Northeastern.
And I'm excited to have this show because it is something near and dear to me. I have a degree, a concentration in journalism from Northeastern, where I went to school at the same time as Dan Kennedy, and where Rich got your master's degree as well. Yep. And so we have some interest in this field. What I want to talk about really is the decline of the prevalence of the major metropolitan daily, or at least the influence of the major metropolitan daily. Things have changed since we were in school a few years ago. And the emergence to fill its place with some of the local outlets like B News. B News took a look around, and we were talking before we went on camera about the number of reporters who covered Burlington not too long ago, that the Woburn Daily Times Chronicle had a couple.
And two full-time people when I was working there in the 80s.
So things have changed. Let's talk about why. What do you see as the reasons for those differences?
Well, I think that what we've seen over the last 10 or 20 years are some economic and cultural changes that have had a very serious effect on the traditional news business that you and I grew up with. I think that it's probably 20 years ago, you could say, that we started moving toward a situation in which we assumed that newspapers would simply move on to free websites and sell advertising, and everybody would be happy and we would move on. And unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. The major reason is that the advertising fled when news started to move online. Craigslist came along and devastated the classified ad business, which used to account for 40% of a newspaper's revenues as recently as a dozen years ago. And so therefore, you had this economic decline, also fed, quite frankly, by the sale of many, many papers owned by individuals or by small chains to bigger and bigger chains that would take on a lot of debt to put together these chains, and then they would have to pay the debt, and they would pay the debt by cutting down on the news, and that harmed local coverage as well.
So the result of all that, at least from my point of view, from what I see, is you have fewer reporters at each of these daily newspapers. They're not paid as much. There's been a collapse in the number of pages available, the news holes, and all of that caused by the fact that there's just less money in it. At the same time, if I'm right, if someone has an interest in coloring the news and providing news in a certain way or from a certain point of view, there's a window of opportunity. And we've got chains that have really developed and flourished in this area because of that.
There's a great opportunity. I mean, there are people who have started nonprofit news sites and sustain themselves in a similar way to a public radio station with grant money and corporate underwriting and donations from readers like you, as they say. And there are some small for-profit news sites that have been launched as well. And it's a lot of work. The people I know who do those sites work incredibly hard, but they're able to sell enough advertising to sustain themselves and do journalism in a new way. The funny thing about the internet is it has removed a lot of the money from the news business, but it's also removed the barriers to entry, so that really anybody who's willing to work hard and has some idea of what they're doing now can give it a shot, whereas was a much more expensive proposition 20 or 30 years ago.
As a professor of journalism and as someone with a master's in journalism, how do you see that? Because there's a balance between access to providing information and then those of us who are trained to do it. Is it a profession that requires training, or is it something that in fact citizens can get involved with and create by creating their websites and doing that?
I think to consistently kind of bring like a reliable news site or a news program, you need to have, somebody who, you don't necessarily need a master's degree, but you do need sort of a training, you do need the consistency of having done it for a long time, and continue to do it, and also you just need the ability to have, dedicate your time. You can't jump in, especially in local news, cover one Board of Selectmen meeting, cover one planning board meeting, and then 3 months later go back to those and expect to kind of know what's going on. You got to sort of stay with the issues and keep up with the day to day of what's happening in the town or city you're covering.
Do you see a difference how long have you been a professor of journalism, Tam?
10 years.
Is there a difference in the focus of the students? Is there a difference in the interest that you see, or even compared from the time that you were in school?
Well, I think that compared to when we were in school, there's quite a difference. There was a large and fairly thriving newspaper business when you and I were going to journalism school, and I think there was an expectation that you could make your way in that business. And I mean, I worked at places like the Woburn Daily Times, Chronicle, and then later at the Boston Phoenix, and the Phoenix no longer exists. Today, I think students know that they're going to have to be innovative in thinking about their careers. I tell them it's kind of the way that people working in the tech business have operated for many years, which is that you may jump from startup to startup. Some of them may fail. Some of them may be a big success, because we're still really in the early stages of trying to figure a lot of this out. How do we do journalism and pay for journalism at a time when the business as we used to know it has changed so completely? And it's not clear. We're still, as I said, we're still really sort of getting up to the starting line in terms of figuring out some of these issues.
Is there still a discussion of the journalist's role? As when we were in school, we would talk about a lot. It was a little post Watergate, it was post Woodward Bernstein, and the role was to get involved in investigative or enterprise journalism, to take on a project, to talk to both sides, to present a story objectively, but to follow the story and get to the bottom, answering the question why, as opposed to just what happened last night. Why did it happen?
Yeah, no, I think that there's still great value in that, absolutely. And you were asking about journalism training. I think Rich is exactly right. You need to get some grounding in journalism, but one of the dirty little secrets is that journalism is not a profession. It's open to anybody. Going to journalism school, I think, gives you a great head start, but it's not completely necessary. The secret sauce in professional journalism is that people are paid to do the work. And when you have volunteers doing it, when you have citizens doing it, some of them do an absolutely terrific job. I'm so impressed with what they do. But they can't put the time and effort into the long investigative pieces that you're talking about that are so vital for holding government to account.
Right. Government
and large institutions.
And I think, like Professor Kennedy was saying earlier, with a lot of the newspapers cutting staff as kind of profits are kind of hard to meet. It's more difficult for a lot of these papers to invest the time in somebody to go out and do the sort of long form investigative journalism. They still have a certain amount of pages to fill or time to fill, and so getting the stories that you have one person who could do 8 stories for a week or just one, for instance, it's kind of difficult to point them towards that one when you have all these other sort of responsibilities.
It's got to be difficult because when you mention covering a selectmen's meeting, someone goes to a selectmen's meeting, they hear testimony from someone, they hear information at a hearing, and the reporter thinks, there's a story there. It's not just that someone said something, it's why, what's behind that, what's the controversy, and rather than listen to what they've reported, let's find out what's the backstory to this. But if that reporter is assigned to do 3 more stories the next day, 3 more meetings, or a meeting in a different town, it's very hard, I would think, for them to find the time to do that.
That's absolutely the case. It's just like I said before, it's versus really being able to get down deep into one subject, or just trying to make sure that you have enough to fill what you're trying to fill, as far as like pages or time. But also I think that the value going to these selectmen meetings, and kind of covering things consistently, you do start to sort of notice the trends, and then you start to know the people who are involved. So just having somebody even cover those meetings, even if they're not covering one meeting, jumping into an investigative report about something that they hear, they're going to over time start to sort of make connections, and then they'll be able to talk to the right people who come up at these meetings consistently, and they'll sort of have a framework for going a little bit deeper without spending all their time doing it.
Right, it's a good way to create that balance.
Right.
What's interesting is, to me anyway, is that BCAT has started its an email system of providing news. I get an email every morning with 3 or 4 interesting stories about Burlington, and that started about 5 or 6 months ago. Is that right?
Yeah, it was one of the things that we wanted to do. I came on in September of last year, and it was sort of to fill what they saw as kind of a void after Patch sort of stopped investing one journalist for every 1 or 2 sites.
Which was you.
Which was me
the
for Burlington.
Right.
And that was one of the things that they did, and we thought it was a good way to connect to readers, have them be able to sign up. Then we know that there's people out there that are looking for what we are putting out, and we just give them an easy way to open up everyone's going to open up their email in the morning anyway, so there it is. We're part of that.
And that's the emergence of what we could call the micro-journalism outlet. These outlets that you're focused on one town, on Burlington. Mm-hmm. And we're going to do Burlington right, and we're going to give you news about Burlington. If you're looking for news about the region, unless it's directly affecting Burlington, there are other places to find that. But your focus is on this town, and you can get into the news about that town in an outlet, a cable TV station that normally we wouldn't consider to be a news source.
Right, and the other benefit of that is, if someone in Burlington has what they think of is an important issue, but it only affects Burlington, some of the larger regional news outlets might not, find the time to get out to it. If they contact us and let us know, we're much more likely to jump on that story.
Dan, is that something that you're seeing more of, cable TV? Community access channels getting involved in providing news to their community?
I actually have seen that, and I think the term of art in journalism is hyperlocal, and I think public access operations at cable outlets are in a prime position to kind of help with that hyperlocal coverage that used to be almost the sole purview of newspapers. I've seen it. I've done some reporting in Haverhill, which is an interesting place where there's a few innovative news projects getting off the ground. And one of the key parts of their media ecosystem is a really first-rate local access cable system. Interestingly enough, they also have an online-only, or it's mostly, excuse me, I'm sorry, it's mostly online radio station. And they have won a license to start a low-power FM station, and they've been ramping up their news coverage. And it's a local advertising executive who's just passionate about this. I can't imagine he's making much money at it, but he's doing it. And that ends up being another voice for the community in a fairly good-sized city in which both the daily and the weekly paper are owned by the same company, and they don't have an office in Haverhill.
It's interesting because this person is motivated, like someone involved with government, in providing that type of a service, information and assistance to the community. Like you say, they may not be getting rich at it, nor are most public servants, but they go to bed satisfied.
That's right, and nobody ever got rich in journalism, so there's nothing new to that.
Right. Now, you've written a book called The Wired City, in which you focus on these hyper-local outlets and the emergence of that, and you're finding that from place to place there's some success following them, right?
It's not, yes, that's right, and it's not a cookie cutter type of thing. People who think that they can that oh well, every town can do this. Well, they need a different approach and a variety of economic models. The Wired City focuses mainly on New Haven, where there is a wonderful nonprofit news site called the New Haven Independent. And I tell their story over the last few years, but they have proven to be very adept at fundraising. And they have 4 full-time journalists covering New Haven, and you'd say 4 people for a city of that size, that's not very good. But then you go across town to the New Haven Register, which is their large regional daily paper, and they've got 80 or 90 people in the newsroom. They have 4 people covering New Haven.
Mm-hmm.
So it really isn't that much different.
Right.
And whereas the New Haven Register is trying to focus on New Haven news that's of interest to their whole region, so it ends up being a lot of Yale, a lot of crime. The New Haven Independent is able to focus on neighborhood news, city politics, school reform, things like that. And it's just been an absolutely vital outlet for community news coverage.
How is that working out for the type of investigation or the enterprise that I'm asking you about? One of the, I would think, the drawbacks to getting involved in the hyperlocal would be you've got people generally who may be living in the community,
Yep.
who, as you say, aren't well paid. So now that they're going to invest in creating, perhaps enemies to themselves.
Right.
It's difficult to do and live and stay in that community.
It's very difficult to do that, absolutely. What I can tell you about New Haven is that a lot of this is the vision of a remarkable local journalist named Paul Bass, who's in the community, invested in the community, and at the same time he is a fearless journalist who has been providing tough coverage of City Hall going back several decades, because he's only been doing this for 10 years, but he had been at other papers and other news organizations before that. The biggest challenge, I think, is that it's the same challenge that Rich was talking about. You're doing a lot of stories, and it's hard to keep going back and doing things. But what the New Haven Independent has really excelled at doing is, once they have a story by the throat, they kind of keep going back to it. Mm-hmm. They return to it over and over and over. And I remember one of their reporters, Thomas McMillan, he's no longer there, but he's moved to New York, but he said that he really liked long form, and he didn't like the fact that at the Independent you couldn't write 4,000 words or whatever. And he said what he finally came to realize is that the long formness emerges over time because you keep going back to the story. And when you are able to do that, you can do some of the investigative stuff that is hard to do on a day-to-day basis. That said, if they had 8 people instead of 4, they would be doing more investigative than they're able to do, because you have to do the news of the day.
Right. But that type of reporting is the type of reporting that, Rich, you can get involved with now and are getting involved with now, in fact, with B News, because we're looking here, for example, the Globe used to have on its regional sections, here at Globe North and Bedford it's Globe West, and there was a time where there was a Northwest, but there used to be 2 a week, now there's 1 a week. And they can't continue to follow up in their region sections because they're only coming out once a week, whereas you're coming out every day, or at least 5 days a week, and have done that. So has the response been good to that?
Yeah, I mean, as far as the kind of the daily updates of the news of the day,
Right.
just specifically for Burlington.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a short period of time here, with B News so far, but getting all the feedback that I've gotten has been good. People, our social media and our newsletter numbers have been growing pretty consistently. So I think people are, happy to see another outlet that just is focusing on the town.
Yeah, in Bedford, they've got an online newspaper that's really met with some tremendous success, The Citizen. It started with some people with some journalism experience, but it lives with contributions from volunteers from the community. Some press releases, but they're careful about what they print. They don't print everything. And here, you have been really the leader in that effort.
Well, I'd like to think so, but I mean, obviously, we have some other local places, the Wicked Local newspaper that does a great job as well. one of the things that I would kind of be interested to hear what Dan has to think about this. We talk about, we happen to be a nonprofit, makes it easy. You talked about, getting funding from, viewers and readers and things like that. The big challenge that I think, faces as far as monetizing these really local sites, to me, I always seen it as local advertisers, when they advertise in a local newspaper, they know that local people are going to see that. When they advertise on a website, I think to a lot of them, they go, oh, it's just going to be on the web. Anybody in the world is not necessarily going to be the people who are in my community who are going to see it. I don't know how these local sites sort of start to convince and to give those advertisers the confidence that yes, we are providing the local content, so it's going to be local people, and make them more eager to advertise on sites like that.
Right.
I don't know
Dan,
if
you've
you
seen
have
some
any-
of that in your research for your book.
It's a great question and it's a great challenge. Probably the site that I spent the second most attention on in the Wired City is a site called the Batavian, which is in western New York, out near Buffalo and Rochester. And that is a for-profit, hyperlocal site competing with a daily paper. And you look at the Batavian, first of all, the guy who runs it, Howard Owens, doesn't believe in rotating ads. He wants them all on the front page. So he's got about 150 local ads, every pizza shop, bank, tattoo parlor, you name it. It's an amazing thing to see. The other thing he does, which I think is very smart, is he does not charge for, it's not a situation where you pay based on how many people see your ad. It's a flat rate. It's like, here's what it's worth, you pay it, and that's that, which is the way newspapers work.
Right.
And I think that a lot of online news has gotten into trouble with this idea that, oh, well, we'll only charge you based on the number of views, and then it becomes just a mess. What he's been able to do is, first of all, you're advertising to the local pizza, one of the local pizza restaurants. The owner soon gets to see whether he's getting any traffic out of that or not. So you can see that. Second of all, he's got very good analytics. You're right, the idea that you're advertising to the whole world is like, well, why would I want to do that for my local insurance agency?
Right.
But he can say, look, 90% of here's my traffic, 90% of it is from Genesee County, and so people can see that it's a local readership. Now, it's taken time. He worked like a dog for several years just convincing people that this was worth advertising in, but he eventually got to the point where people could see that this was a value, and it did help them promote their local businesses, and so therefore he's had some success doing that. But it takes time and it takes a lot of work.
Especially, it would seem to me, where he's able to talk about the essential monopoly that these sites that focus on their communities have on the news coming out of their community. Because going back to the overall topic that I bring up, because the major metropolitan dailies are ignoring that for the most part. And you bring up a good point, which is that we have the Gatehouse Media weeklies here in the district. They do a great job, but their focus is as a weekly, which is printed a couple days before it comes out. So their focus is on the news that they can prepare in that way, and as opposed to a daily focus, which can be updated each morning with the details, the up-to-date details each time.
Yeah, I think have a little bit more of a focus on trying to be a little quicker. The idea also, with coming from where I came from with Patch, is we try to keep up more with the like the social media alerts, very active on Twitter, kind of letting people know, there's an accident here, there's, a fire here, this road is closed, try to get that out as fast as possible, as well as, then trying to build up towards our weekly, news taping,
Right.
which is kind of the recap of the week.
Yeah, which you do a great job with as well. Phil Gallagher gets involved with doing that, and Brad Bond, and yourself.
Yeah, we have
it's a great team.
Different, rotating anchors, but Phil's our main guy.
Right, right. And Bedford and Burlington benefits from that by having that, Bedford with the Citizen. Any thoughts on, we were talking about the changing roles of journalism. Where is this all going? What do you think? Is there any way to predict it at all, or are we on in an age now where anything can happen next?
I think we're in an age where anything can happen next. If I could predict the future, I could be an extremely high-paid consultant. I don't think anybody can predict the future. I think that one of the biggest challenges that we're wrestling with at the moment is that those of us who feel like we've adapted to the digital age pretty well, nevertheless are still locked into certain brands, you might say. I want to see the New York Times, the Globe, the local paper, and whether they're online or offline, that's fine. I think the generation younger than us, even younger than you, Rich, really does not care where their news is coming from.
Right.
And I'm not saying that they don't have some opinions about what's reliable and what isn't. They do, some very strong opinions, but they want to be exposed to news that their friends are sharing with them, that they're encountering on Facebook, that they're encountering on Twitter. I mean, we do that too to some extent. But I think that we sometimes refer to that as disaggregation.
Yeah.
And that is a huge challenge. That is an absolutely huge challenge. The Christian Science Monitor, a great legacy newspaper that is almost entirely digital now, gets 17% of their traffic from their homepage. Everything else is coming in from social media.
Right.
How do you leverage that? How do you get that traffic? It's a huge challenge.
And so what that means is that people are reading story by story
Yes.
rather than newspaper by newspaper or
Yep.
media outlet by media outlet. And it happens in the music industry too. The age of albums as an album as opposed to 12 or 14 songs that all have one thing to do with each other. Now people are ripping one song to another or listening to one song to another. It happens now in the news industry as well.
Well, and I think it's dangerous in the news industry because what's going to be shared first and probably most widely aren't the in-depth or serious stories. It's going to be a lot of the, this politician made this gaffe or this celebrity did that, and that's going to be what's going to start to trend on Twitter or be shared a lot on social media. And then not only that means that most people who aren't going to the New York Times website and seeing all the other coverage are going to only see those. Other news outlets are going to say, well, that's what's popular, and kind of is a flood effect.
Right.
So it's kind of a problem where a lot of what becomes popular is trivial, and what's trivial then becomes more popular as it gets spread.
I think you're very right, and it goes into one of my concerns, which is that it seems that the lead story in many, whether it be an online outlet or otherwise, is the reaction to the story that never got out there in the first place. So Americans are all upset because, and you didn't get the because yet.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it allows the reader to sort of think, well, there's an inside joke going on that I guess I don't get, so I guess I should be upset. And they never really figure out the underlying situation, and then news goes from day to day, and it's still the noise is what seems to gain the discussion. Similarly, we hear that Donald Trump is either leading in New Hampshire or one of the top two in New Hampshire, and that's news. Well, why? That seems to be the news to me, is how did that happen?
You're right, but I have to say, you could go back 20, 30, 40 years, and the news media's coverage of politics has always been superficial and horse race based. So I don't think it's gotten better, but I'm not sure that it's gotten worse either. That's always been a problem.
Well, let's hope that the access to the news through the online sites will somehow, maybe that's what's coming, somehow provide the opportunity for more people to get more of these in-depth stories to analyze why things are happening as opposed to that they are.
That's right.
Or
And
in addition to it.
and we've had the rise of some of these explainer websites that do try to go in depth on a variety of topics, such as Vox 538. The New York Times and the Washington Post have their own dedicated websites to that type of journalism. And the Globe has a young guy named, well, they're all young compared to me, a guy named Evan Horowitz who tries to do these explainers on the news online. And that has a lot of value as well, I think, because certainly in the last week, trying to figure out how Greece got to where it is today has been much more of a challenge than the day-to-day news about Greece, and yet ultimately it's more important.
Right, that comprehensive understanding is important. Well, we're coming to an understanding that our time is up here on Rapping with the Rep. And so I really appreciate your coming on to the show. Dan Kennedy, thank you very much.
Thank you,
Rich
Ken.
Hosford, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. This is Rapping with the Rep. I'm State Representative Ken Gordon. Thank you for joining us.